Ethan Carter was a man of ambition, power, and control. At just 33, he stood at the pinnacle of success, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. His name graced magazine covers, and his every move was scrutinized by the media. But while the world admired his sharp mind and relentless drive, few knew of the cold emptiness that consumed him. Ethan's life was devoid of genuine relationships. He thrived on deals, contracts, and profits, but when the lights dimmed and the cameras turned away, he found himself utterly alone. It was on a stormy night that Ethan's life took an unexpected turn. He had been traveling to a small industrial city to inspect a newly acquired manufacturing plant, a routine task he usually delegated, but this time he decided to handle it personally. Rain lashed against the windows of his sleek black car as it sped along the narrow, deserted highway. His driver, an older man named George, glanced nervously at the road ahead. "Sir, the weather's getting worse. Perhaps we should stop and wait it out," George suggested, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Ethan didn't look up from his phone. "Keep driving, George. I have no intention of wasting time. We need to be there by morning." The rain intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet. The wind howled, and the car's wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated a fallen tree blocking the road. George swerved to avoid it, but the tires skidded on the slick asphalt. The car spun out of control. The last thing Ethan heard was the deafening crash of metal and the shattering of glass before everything went dark. Once a billionaire at the peak of his power, Ethan Carter's life took a devastating turn. Stranded, injured, and helpless on a stormy night. But fate had other plans when a beggar woman, Ava Grace, saved him. Little did they know this chance encounter would change both their lives forever. Ethan woke to a dull ache radiating through his body. His head throbbed, and he felt the warm trickle of blood on his temple. The car lay on its side in a ditch, its engine silent. George was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. Ethan tried to move, but pain shot through his leg. He realized he couldn't stand. Panic set in as he looked around. The road was eerily quiet, the rain now a steady drizzle. His phone was nowhere to be found, and the nearest town was miles away. He was trapped, vulnerable, and, for the first time in years, afraid. Hours seemed to pass as Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. The cold seeped into his bones, and the reality of his isolation weighed heavily on him. He had always prided himself on his independence, but now lying helpless in a wrecked car, he felt a deep, unfamiliar helplessness. And then he saw her. A figure emerged from the darkness, her silhouette illuminated by the dim light of the moon peeking through the clouds. She was thin, almost frail, wrapped in layers of mismatched, tattered clothing. Her hair clung to her face, wet from the rain. For a moment, Ethan thought he was hallucinating. The woman approached cautiously, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He managed a weak nod. The woman assessed the situation quickly, her gaze darting between Ethan and the unconscious driver. "You need help," she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. With surprising strength for someone of her slight build, she climbed into the car and gently pulled Ethan free, careful not to worsen his injuries. She then turned her attention to George, managing to rouse him just enough to help him climb out. "Who are you?" Ethan croaked, his voice hoarse. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she draped Ethan's arm over her shoulder, supporting his weight as they began the slow, arduous trek to her shelter. The shelter was a small, ramshackle structure made of salvaged wood and metal sheets, tucked away in an alley on the outskirts of the city. It was far from luxurious, barely more than a roof over her head, but it was dry and safe. She helped Ethan onto a makeshift bed, a pile of blankets arranged on the floor, and lit a small oil lamp, casting a warm glow across the room. "My name is Ava," she said finally, kneeling beside him. She cleaned his wounds with careful precision, her touch gentle but firm. "You're lucky I found you. That crash could have been much worse." "My name is Ava," she said finally, kneeling beside him. She cleaned his wounds with careful precision, her touch gentle but firm. "You're lucky I found you. That crash could have been much worse." Ethan watched her silently, his mind racing. She was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. Her clothes were worn and patched, her hands rough from labor, but her eyes held a quiet strength that captivated him. She moved with purpose, her every action deliberate and efficient. He couldn't understand why someone in her situation, a beggar by all appearances, would go out of her way to help a complete stranger. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Ava paused, meeting his gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply, as though the question itself was absurd. Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only acted out of self-interest. Genuine kindness was a rarity in his world, and yet here it was, offered freely by someone who had nothing to gain. Over the next few hours, Ava continued to care for Ethan, bringing him water and a bowl of soup she had prepared from her meager supplies. Ethan, unused to relying on anyone, found himself both humbled and intrigued by her selflessness. Despite the pain and discomfort, he couldn't help but notice the warmth in her smile and the compassion in her eyes. As the night wore on, the rain subsided, leaving a calm, quiet stillness in its wake. Ethan drifted in and out of sleep, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. A sense of vulnerability, yes, but also a strange, inexplicable comfort. When morning came, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the shelter's walls, Ethan opened his eyes to find Ava sitting nearby, her head resting on her knees as she dozed lightly. She looked peaceful, almost ethereal, despite the hardships etched into her features. In that moment, Ethan knew that his life would never be the same. Ava had saved him, not just from the wreckage of the crash, but from the emptiness he had long ignored. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Ethan Carter lay on the makeshift bed in Ava's humble shelter, his body sore and his mind restless. The events of the previous night replayed in his head, the crash, the endless hours of helplessness, and then Ava. Her face lingered in his thoughts, her quiet strength and kindness standing in stark contrast to the opulence and coldness of his world. As the morning light filtered into the shelter, Ava stirred from her spot by the window. She had stayed awake most of the night, keeping an eye on Ethan and ensuring he was comfortable. Despite her own exhaustion, there was a calm determination in her every move. Ethan shifted slightly, wincing as pain flared in his leg. Ava noticed immediately and moved closer, her voice soft but firm. "Don't try to move too much. Your leg is bruised badly and you've got a few cuts that need time to heal." Ethan studied her as she spoke. Her clothes were simple, worn and patched, yet there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. Her hazel eyes, striking and warm, held a kindness he wasn't accustomed to. Clearing his throat, he asked, "Why are you helping me?" Ava paused, her hands busy preparing a small bowl of oatmeal from her limited supplies. "I told you last night, it's the right thing to do." Ethan frowned, unaccustomed to such straightforward altruism. "Most people would have walked past me or called for someone else to handle it. You didn't." Ava smiled faintly as she handed him the bowl. "Most people don't know what it's like to be invisible, to be in pain and have no one notice." "I do." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken stories. Ethan wanted to ask more, but something in her expression told him she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he accepted the bowl, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he quickly focused on the food, unsure why he suddenly felt so unsettled. Over the next 2 days, Ethan remained in Ava's shelter, unable to move much without assistance. During that time, their conversations grew slowly but steadily more personal. Ethan, used to dominating discussions and negotiations, found himself listening more than talking. Ava's voice had a soothing quality, and her stories, though laced with hardship, revealed a resilience that impressed and intrigued him. "I wasn't always like this," Ava admitted one evening as she carefully wrapped a fresh bandage around Ethan's arm. "I had a job, a family, a life. Then everything fell apart." Ethan tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What happened?" She hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-motion. "The pandemic," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It took my parents, my home, and my job. I tried to rebuild, but every door I knocked on stayed shut. Eventually I ended up here." Ethan's chest tightened. He had heard similar stories before, but hearing it directly from someone who had lived through it made it feel painfully real. "You didn't have anyone to help you?" Ava shook her head, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes all you have is yourself. And if you're lucky, the kindness of strangers." Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. He had always believed in self-reliance, in forging one's path through sheer willpower. But Ava's story made him question how much of his success had been due to luck, privilege, and opportunities he had long taken for granted. As the days passed, their connection deepened. Ava's quiet strength and unflinching honesty drew Ethan in, while his vulnerability allowed her to see a side of him the world rarely glimpsed. Their conversations ranged from light-hearted banter to deep, soul-bearing confessions. One evening, as the rain pattered gently against the roof, Ava shared a memory that brought tears to her eyes. "Before everything fell apart, I loved to paint," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I'd spend hours creating, losing myself in the colours and shapes. It was the one thing that made me feel alive." Ethan listened intently, imagining a younger, happier Ava, surrounded by vibrant canvases. "Why don't you paint anymore?" he asked gently. She looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Paint costs money. So do brushes and canvases. Survival doesn't leave much room for dreams." The sadness in her voice tugged at Ethan's heart. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. "Dreams shouldn't die just because life gets hard," he said softly. "Sometimes they're all we have." Ava looked at him, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, as though they were both on the brink of something unspoken. But just as quickly, Ava pulled her hand away, retreating into the safety of distance. Ethan couldn't shake the growing feelings Ava stirred in him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, kind, selfless, and fiercely independent despite her circumstances. The walls he had spent years building around his heart began to crumble piece by piece under her quiet influence. Ava, too, found herself drawn to Ethan in ways she hadn't expected. He was everything she had been taught to mistrust, rich, powerful, and seemingly untouchable. Yet here he was, vulnerable and human, showing her glimpses of a soul that yearned for connection. She fought against the feelings blooming within her, convinced their worlds were too far apart for anything real to happen. One night, as they sat in the dim light of the oil lamp, Ethan broke the silence. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You saved my life, Ava." She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," he replied, his gaze steady. "That's what makes you so extraordinary." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ava felt her cheeks flush and quickly looked away, unsure how to respond. Ethan, too, felt a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, he felt alive, not because of success or wealth, but because of the presence of someone who saw him for who he truly was. As their time together stretched on, both Ethan and Ava found themselves at a crossroads. Their connection was undeniable, but the unspoken barriers between them loomed large. Ethan was a billionaire accustomed to control and luxury, while Ava was a woman who had lost everything but her pride and resilience. Little did they know, the bond they had forged in this small, broken shelter would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. And the days in Ava's shelter passed like fleeting moments, each one leaving an indelible mark on Ethan's heart. Though his physical wounds had begun to heal, something deeper stirred within him. Ava's unyielding kindness, her quiet resilience, and the spark of hope that lit her hazel eyes had become a beacon in the darkness he hadn't realized he was living in. But now the time had come for him to leave. His assistant had finally tracked him down, sending a car to pick him up. George had been safely transferred to a hospital the day before, and Ethan, though reluctant, knew he couldn't stay any longer. Still, he wasn't ready to part ways with the woman who had saved him, not without ensuring she had a way out of the life she was trapped in. Ethan stood by the doorway of Ava's shelter, leaning on a crutch. His tailored clothes, though now rumpled and worn, looked oddly out of place in her modest surroundings. Ava, ever practical, was packing a small bag of supplies for him: bandages, a water bottle, and the last of her carefully rationed food. Her movements were brisk, but her trembling hands betrayed the emotions she tried so hard to hide. "You've done enough," Ethan said softly, watching her. "I can't take anything more from you." Ava glanced up, her expression firm. "You're still recovering. It's a long journey back, and you'll need these." For a moment there was only silence, broken by the distant hum of the waking city. Ethan studied her face, committing every detail to memory: the curve of her cheek, the strands of hair that framed her face, the way her eyes shone with quiet strength. Finally he spoke. "Ava, come with me." She froze, her hands stilling as she turned to face him. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated, his voice earnest. "You don't have to live like this. I can help you get back on your feet, a proper home, a job, anything you need." Ava's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something unreadable. "Ethan, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't." "Why not?" he asked, frustration creeping into his tone. "You've been nothing but selfless, helping me without expecting anything in return. Let me do the same for you." She shook her head, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Because I don't want charity. I've spent too long fighting to hold on to my dignity. If I come with you, it has to be because I earned it, not because you feel guilty or grateful." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how much her pride and independence meant to her. Ava wasn't someone who could be bought or saved with money. She was someone who needed to chart her own path, no matter how difficult. Reluctantly, Ethan accepted her decision, though it left a hollow ache in his chest. When the car arrived to pick him up, he turned to Ava one last time, his gaze steady and full of unspoken gratitude. "If you ever change your mind, or if you need anything, call me." He pulled a sleek business card from his wallet and held it out to her. Ava hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Thank you," she said quietly, tucking the card into the pocket of her jacket. Ethan climbed into the car, his heart heavy as the vehicle pulled away. Through the rearview mirror, he saw Ava standing in the doorway of her shelter, her figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. He clenched his fists, determined not to let this be the last time he saw her. Back in the comfort of his penthouse, Ethan found himself restless. The luxurious surroundings that had once brought him pride now felt hollow. Memories of Ava's shelter, her laughter, her unwavering resolve, haunted him. He couldn't shake the thought of her, how someone with so little had given so much without hesitation. Determined to repay her kindness in a way that respected her independence, Ethan delved into research. What he discovered both inspired and saddened him. Ava had once been a promising young artist with a scholarship to a prestigious university. Her work had been showcased in small galleries, earning praise for its raw emotion and unique style. But tragedy struck when her parents passed away, leaving her to drop out and take on multiple jobs to survive. One setback had led to another, eventually pushing her to the brink of poverty. Ethan's heart ached as he read the reports. Ava's story wasn't one of failure, but of a system that had failed her. He realized he didn't just want to help her, he wanted to see her thrive, to reclaim the dreams she had been forced to abandon. Two weeks later, Ethan stood outside Ava's shelter once again. This time he came prepared, his tailored suit replaced with casual clothes to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Ava stepped out, surprise flickering across her face before her expression settled into cautious wariness. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he said simply, his eyes searching hers. "And I have a proposition." She folded her arms, suspicion flickering in her gaze. "What kind of proposition?" He took a deep breath. "I want you to work for me, not as a favor or an act of charity, but because I believe in you. I've seen your strength, your intelligence, and your resilience. I want to give you a job where you can use those qualities to their fullest." Ava's brow furrowed, her wariness softening into curiosity. "What kind of job?" "A role at one of my companies," he explained. "You'll start wherever you're comfortable and you can work your way up. No handouts, no strings attached, just an opportunity to rebuild your life." Ava's gaze softened, though doubt still lingered in her expression. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I believe in you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And because you gave me a second chance when you didn't have to. Let me do the same for you." And after a long pause, Ava nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll take the job, but only if I earn my place." Ethan smiled, relief washing over him like a wave. "You will, Ava. I have no doubt about that." As they walked away from the shelter together, a sense of hope and possibility filled the air. Neither of them could predict the journey ahead, but for the first time in a long while, both felt a spark of something they thought they had lost, a chance to start over. Ava Grace stepped through the gleaming glass doors of Carter Enterprises, her nerves fluttering like trapped birds in a cage. The grand lobby stretched endlessly before her, its marble floors shimmering under the soft glow of modern chandeliers. Around her, professionals in tailored suits moved with purpose, their faces sharp and focused. This world was so far removed from the narrow alleys and rundown shelters she had known. For a moment she hesitated, gripping the strap of her worn canvas bag as if it could anchor her. At the far end of the lobby, Ethan Carter stood waiting. His sharp gaze found her instantly, and a small, genuine smile softened his expression. That smile sent a strange mix of comfort and uncertainty rushing through Ava's chest. "You made it," he said, his voice steady as he approached her. "I almost didn't," Ava admitted, glancing around at the grandeur surrounding her. "I feel like I don't belong here." "You do," Ethan said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Everyone starts somewhere. Today is your beginning." Ava's first day at Carter Enterprises was overwhelming. She'd been placed in the operations department, starting as an administrative assistant. It wasn't a glamorous role, but it was a chance to prove both to herself and to Ethan that she could rise above her circumstances. The team welcomed her with a mix of curious glances and polite indifference. Some co-workers dismissed her as a charity hire. Others quietly speculated about her background. Ava kept her head down, refusing to let the whispers distract her. Instead, she threw herself into her work, learning every process, policy, and system with determination. Her mind absorbed the company's inner workings like a sponge. True to his word, Ethan didn't interfere in her daily tasks. He observed her progress from a distance, ensuring she had what she needed without overshadowing her efforts. Still, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride every time he saw her tackle a challenge with resilience and intelligence. Then one evening, long after most employees had gone home, Ava sat alone at her desk. In front of her lay a stack of reports detailing an issue with one of the company's key distribution channels, a problem that had stumped her team for weeks. She stared at the data, frustration gnawing at her. Then, almost instinctively, she grabbed a scrap piece of paper and began sketching a flowchart. Her artistic instincts took over. Lines, shapes, and ideas filled the page as her mind pieced together a solution no one else had considered. The next morning, during a department meeting, Ava hesitated before speaking up. Her heart raced as she presented her idea, expecting dismissal or worse, ridicule. Instead, the room fell silent. Her manager leaned forward, studying the diagrams with growing interest. This could work, he said slowly, his voice tinged with surprise. Why didn't we think of this before? Ava's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and disbelief. For the first time, she felt like she'd truly made a difference, like she belonged. Word of Ava's idea reached Ethan's office within hours. He called her in that afternoon, his expression unreadable as she entered. Ava stood nervously, unsure of what to expect. "I heard about your solution," Ethan began, his voice calm but edged with admiration. "You saved the company a lot of time and money. I just saw something others didn't," Ava replied, her voice soft and modest. Ethan smiled, a genuine warm smile. "You're too humble. You have a gift, Ava. I'm glad to see you using it." For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't just gratitude or respect, it was something deeper, more complicated. Ava quickly looked away, her cheeks warming under his gaze. As weeks turned into months, Ava and Ethan's paths began to cross more often. He started inviting her to strategy meetings, subtly encouraging her to share her insights. She, in turn, found herself drawn to his quiet intelligence and the way he carried himself, with confidence, yes, but also with a vulnerability that few people seemed to notice. One evening, after a particularly long day, Ethan found Ava sitting alone in the rooftop garden. The city lights sparkled like scattered stars, casting a soft glow over her thoughtful expression. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Ava looked up, startled but not unhappy to see him. "Of course." He sat beside her, and for a while they simply enjoyed the silence. Then Ethan spoke. "You've been doing incredibly well, Ava. Better than I ever expected." "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I still feel like I have so much to prove." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes steady. "You don't have to prove anything to me. I already see who you are, strong, capable, and extraordinary." Ava's breath caught at his words. She looked at him, her heart pounding as his piercing blue eyes held hers. "Why are you so kind to me, Ethan?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you showed me kindness when I least deserved it, and because you've changed the way I see the world." For a moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. Ava's heart raced, her emotions swirling in ways she couldn't quite control. But before she could say anything, Ethan stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "I should let you get some rest," he said softly. "Good night, Ava." "Good night," she replied, watching him disappear into the shadows. Despite her growing success, Ava faced challenges within the company. Rumors began to swirl about her relationship with Ethan, whispers fueled by jealousy and suspicion. Some claimed she was using him to climb the ladder, while others questioned her qualifications outright. When the gossip finally reached Ava, it stung more than she'd expected. One afternoon, she stormed into Ethan's office, her voice trembling with frustration. "People think I'm only here because of you, that I don't deserve this job." Ethan's expression darkened. Let them talk. You've proven yourself, Ava. Anyone who doesn't see that is blind. But it hurts, she admitted, her voice breaking. I've worked so hard, and it feels like none of it matters. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze intense. It matters to me, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve. Ava's eyes filled with tears at his words. She saw the sincerity in his expression, the unwavering belief he had in her. In that moment, she realized just how much he cared. Not just about her work, but about her as a person. With Ethan's support, Ava pushed through the challenges, using every obstacle as fuel for her determination. Her breakthrough idea led to further successes, and slowly, even the harshest critics began to respect her. Ava carved out a place for herself, proving that her talent and hard work were undeniable. As she stood in the bustling office one evening, watching her team implement her latest project, a surge of pride filled her chest. She had come so far from the woman who had struggled to survive on the streets, and while her journey was far from over, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer defined by her past. Months had passed since Ava first walked through the doors of Carter Enterprises, and her life had transformed in ways she never thought possible. She had gone from surviving on the streets to thriving in a corporate world she'd once only seen from afar. With each challenge she overcame, Ava rediscovered the confidence and passion she thought had been lost forever. Yet, beneath her professional successes, an undeniable connection simmered between her and Ethan. It was unspoken but ever present, creating a tension that neither could ignore. One afternoon, during a routine brainstorming session, Ava found herself doodling on a blank page. As the meeting dragged on, her thoughts wandered to a question that had been lingering in her mind. How could Carter Enterprises expand its reach while creating meaningful change? The answer came in a flash, a fusion of her past struggles and her present opportunities. Slowly she raised her hand, unsure of how her idea would be received. "I have an idea," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her, some curious, others doubtful. Ethan, seated at the head of the table, nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Ava." She hesitated, then plunged forward. "What if we create a community program that empowers underprivileged individuals by providing them with jobs and skills training? We could partner with local organizations to develop a supply chain that not only serves our business, but uplifts the community." A murmur rippled through the room. One senior executive shook his head dismissively. "That's a nice thought, but it's not practical. Our job is to maximize profits, not run a charity." Before Ava could respond, Ethan's calm, authoritative voice cut through the room. "Sometimes profit and purpose go hand in hand. Ava, please continue." With renewed confidence, she presented the model she had sketched out in her spare time. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with curiosity, and even the skeptics seemed intrigued. Ethan stood, addressing the group. "This has potential. I want a dedicated team assigned to explore this further, with Ava leading it." The room erupted into murmurs, but no one challenged Ethan's authority. Ava, stunned, managed to whisper, "Thank you." As the program took shape, Ava and Ethan spent more time working together. Late nights became a routine, filled with debates, laughter, and fleeting moments of vulnerability. Their discussions ranged from strategic plans to the personal stories that shaped their lives. One evening, as they reviewed the final proposal, Ava leaned back and sighed. "Sometimes this still feels unreal, like I'm dreaming." Ethan looked up from his laptop, his expression softening. "You're here because you've earned it, Ava. Every bit of it." She smiled, though her voice grew quieter. "It's just hard not to wonder if things would have been different if I hadn't met you that night." "You would have made it," Ethan said firmly. "It might have taken longer, but someone like you, resilient, brilliant, and compassionate was always meant to rise. Her cheeks flushed under his gaze. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of hero." "Maybe you are," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You just don't see it yet." The words hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Ava quickly shifted her focus back to the papers in front of her, but the moment lingered in the air. So the launch day was a whirlwind. Community leaders, media outlets, and employees gathered to celebrate the unveiling of the initiative. Ava stood on the stage beside Ethan, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to deliver her speech. "You've got this," Ethan whispered, his voice low and reassuring. "Just speak from the heart." Drawing strength from his words, Ava stepped forward. As she spoke, her voice steadied, her passion evident in every word. She shared her story, the struggles she had faced, the people who had inspired her, and the vision that had brought them all together. The audience was captivated. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ethan took the microphone next, his words brief but heartfelt. This program wouldn't exist without Ava Grace. Her vision, determination, and compassion have brought us here today. She's proof that every person has the potential to create change when given the opportunity. Tears welled in Ava's eyes as the crowd cheered. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not just as a survivor, but as a leader. That evening, after the event had ended, Ava retreated to the rooftop garden. The city's lights sparkled below her, reflecting the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process everything. Ethan found her there, his footsteps soft against the tiles. "I thought I'd find you here." She turned to face him, her expression vulnerable. "I just needed some air. Today was overwhelming." "In the best way, I hope," he said, stepping closer. "It was," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's also terrifying. What if I can't live up to this?" "You can," Ethan said without hesitation. "You already have." She looked at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "Why do you believe in me so much?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke with quiet intensity. "Because you remind me of what's possible when someone refuses to give up. You've made me see the world differently, made me want to be better." Ava's heart pounded as his words settled over her. For a moment she thought he might step closer, close the distance between them. But then his phone buzzed, pulling him back to reality. Ethan sighed, stepping away to take the call. As he walked off, Ava watched him, her emotions swirling. She knew there was something between them, something real. But was she ready to face it? The program's success catapulted Ava into the spotlight, earning her recognition across the industry. Ethan ensured she received the credit she deserved, officially naming her a partner in the initiative. Their partnership wasn't just professional, it was built on mutual respect, trust, and a connection that grew deeper with every passing day. As they stood side by side, watching their vision come to life, both knew their story was far from over. The success of the community program marked a pivotal chapter in Ava's life. But as she rose professionally, a deeper, more personal transformation began to unfold between her and Ethan. What had started as unspoken glances and fleeting moments grew into something undeniable, a bond they could no longer ignore. Yet, their feelings were tangled in uncertainty, weighed down by the responsibilities they carried and the wounds they both hid. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Ethan invited Ava to dinner. It wasn't unusual for them to share meals after late nights at work, but something about this invitation felt different. The restaurant he chose was elegant, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The intimate ambiance set Ava on edge, her nerves heightened by the subtle shift in tone. "This feels different," she said, her voice soft as she traced the edge of her napkin. "It is," Ethan admitted, his blue eyes meeting hers with disarming sincerity. I wanted to thank you for everything, not just for the program, but for what you've brought into my life. Ava's cheeks warmed. You don't have to thank me. None of this would have been possible without your support. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. It's more than support, Ava. You've changed how I see the world. Before I met you, everything was about numbers, control, and winning. You've shown me there's more to life, people, connection, purpose. Her heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment it seemed as though he might say more. But before Ethan could continue, the waiter arrived to refill their glasses, breaking the intimacy of the moment. When the waiter left, Ethan hesitated, his earlier courage seemingly fading. Sensing his inner conflict, Ava changed the subject, steering the conversation back to safer topics. But as the evening wore on, the weight of what was left unsaid lingered between them, leaving Ava to wonder what might have happened had they not been interrupted. A few days later, Ava found Ethan in his office long after hours. He stood by the windows, silhouetted against the twinkling city lights, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a rare vulnerability. Something about his posture, the slight slump of his shoulders, the tension in his frame, tugged at her heart. Ethan, she called gently from the doorway. He turned, startled by her presence. Ava, what are you doing here so late? I could ask you the same thing, she replied, offering a small smile. You've been avoiding everyone today. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. Ava stepped closer, her concern evident. Talk to me. You've been there for me more times than I can count. Let me be here for you. He hesitated but then gestured for her to sit. As she took a seat, Ethan began to speak, his voice low and raw. He shared pieces of his past, the isolation of growing up in a home where love was conditional, the relentless pressure to succeed, and the emptiness that had haunted him even at the peak of his accomplishments. I thought I had everything, he admitted, his gaze distant. But it wasn't until I met you that I realized how much I was missing. Ava's breath caught at his words. Ethan, you're not alone anymore. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with an emotion that made her heart ache. You make me feel like I'm enough, Ava. For the first time I feel like I don't have to prove anything, like I can just be. The raw intensity of his words left her speechless. For a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with unspoken possibilities. But before either could act, Ethan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I'm sorry, he said, standing abruptly. I didn't mean to unload all of that on you. You didn't, Ava replied, rising to her feet. Ethan, you've done so much for me. Let me be here for you too. He nodded, his vulnerability still visible in his eyes. Thank you, Ava. A few weeks later, Ava and Ethan stood together at the opening of the program's first community centre. The air buzzed with life. Families received aid, individuals attended workshops, and children played outside on the newly built playground. It was everything Ava had envisioned, brought to life by months of hard work and unwavering dedication. This is incredible, Ava said, her eyes shining as she took in the scene. I still can't believe it's real. It's real because of you, Ethan said, his voice steady. None of this would have happened without your vision. She turned to him, her smile warm. It's a team effort, Ethan. You've been with me every step of the way. He hesitated, his heart pounding. Ava, there's something I need to tell you. Her smile faded slightly as she noticed the seriousness in his tone. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath, summoning the courage he had been holding back for months. I've tried to keep this professional, to focus on the work, but the truth is, I care about you. More than I've ever cared about anyone. Ava's eyes widened, her breath catching. Ethan? I know it's sudden, he continued, his voice filled with raw emotion, but it's not. It's been building since the night we met. You've changed my life, Ava. You've made me believe in something bigger than myself." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, her heart overwhelmed by his words. "I don't know what to say." "Say you feel the same," Ethan said softly, stepping closer. "Say I'm not alone in this." Ava hesitated, her emotions swirling. But as she looked into his eyes, filled with hope, vulnerability, and an unspoken promise, she knew she couldn't deny the truth any longer. "You're not alone," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I care about you too, Ethan, more than I ever thought I could." Relief and joy lit up his face as he reached for her hand, his touch steady and warm. "Then let's figure this out together." Surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the laughter of lives they had touched, they shared their first kiss, a tender, heartfelt moment that cemented the bond they had been building all along. And their relationship, like their journey, wasn't without challenges. They faced scrutiny from colleagues, their own lingering insecurities, and the scars of their pasts. But together they found strength in each other, creating a partnership that went beyond business. As they continued to expand their program and touch countless lives, Ava and Ethan became a living testament to the power of love, resilience, and redemption. Their story was proof that even in the darkest moments, second chances could lead to the brightest futures, and that love, when nurtured, could truly change the world.